Who you gonna call? Ghostbusters! Alright, I almost didn't actually even watch this movie, and it's easy to pass on movies like this after all the failed remakes that Hollywood's been pumping out lately. And studios always do this kind of thing, right? They're trying to reinvigorate franchises from the 80s for a newer, younger audience. And in fact, studios love old franchises because they're really easy to sell. There's a bunch of cultural awareness around established IPs that guarantees some base level of interest, and from the studio side, nobody is really going to lose their jobs if they recommend pitching a new piece of a franchise because the risk is so low. And all of this is why making a successful sequel to a decades-old franchise is always a 50-50 shot. To make a reboot successful, you need a new cast, you need to continue the story that people know and love in some form or way, but most importantly, I think you really need to break new ground with the story in a way that gives it relevant cultural subtext. And there's been a few movies that do this to varying degrees of success, right? Like, look at Star Wars, Blade Runner, Planet of the Apes, Marvel. They all rebooted franchises decades after the IP went stale, and some were loved by critics but hated by fans. Some saw massive financial success but handled their storytelling poorly, and there's been a select few that managed to capture lightning in a bottle. For these reasons, I came into this movie really assuming that it would be another half-assed reboot of a dead franchise, and I have to say I was wrong. And yeah, this movie is packed with fan service, and the story is very similar to the first one. Don't get me wrong, it's not anything insane or perfect here, but it's getting a lot of love and hate alike, typically for the aforementioned fan service reason. And in watching reviews of this movie, I also think people who love it kind of love it for the wrong reasons. Like, the usual toxic alt-right and all-male circuit of YouTubers are praising this movie for, quote, undoing Ghostbusters Answer the Call. And like, no, I mean, I get that like a little girl taking lead is not as threatening to them as like a Melissa McCarthy or a Kristen Wiig might be, but I think that's a terrible reason to love a movie, right? I like it because it's got less women in it. Okay, 2 words, Bridesmaids. Now, there's the exit. It's at the rear of the theater. Thank you, don't come back, and don't forget to like and subscribe on your way out. But all that shit aside, I think this movie is an easy miss because it's competing with the likes of Dune, James Bond, The Eternals. It's all competing for your Saturday night ticket. These major IPs that have had a lot more going on over the last several years, and with the pandy coming to an end, the theater industry has become very oversaturated with new movie releases. So who really wants to see another Ghostbusters movie when the last few haven't exactly lived up to the hype? Anyway, all this to say, I think it's easy to pass on this movie, and it's wrought with pretty weird feedback, and reviews are praising things about this movie that aren't the things that I think this movie deserves to be praised for. But I think that out of everything Ghostcore has put out since the original movie, this one is probably the most important film. Afterlife acts well on its own as a direct sequel to the very first Ghostbusters, and it's a true passing of the torch film, with all the references and homages being handled with care instead of just being, purely fan service. And yeah, it's very fan servicey, like, don't get me wrong, but not to the point where I think it's detrimental to the film as a whole. It really is trying to do its own thing, and the areas where it broke new ground are actually pretty meaningful and well done. But to talk about what this film has done right and what it's trying to say with a new generation of Ghostbusters, we really have to start with the original Ghostbusters. And before I tell you why, I have to say spoilers ahead. And also, like this video, please just do it right now. If you change your mind later, you can undo it, but you'll probably get caught up in my awesome analysis of this movie and forget to like it. So just do it now. You can always undo it later. Please and thank you. Oh yeah, and also subscribe if you're not subscribed already. Okay, now let's bust this movie wide open. Where was I? Oh yeah, right. Like I said, to get this movie, we have to revisit the 1984 original. And I gave that one a rewatch after I left the theater the other day. And I forgot how much I loved it. It's bright and it's absurd. It's a lighthearted film that doesn't take itself super seriously. But upon further inspection, I realized that its satirical tone is actually pretty important to communicating the subtext of this movie. At first, it seems to champion the spirit of the 80s when neo-capitalism was this revolutionary new thing, but digging a layer deeper, I realized it's actually mocking that Reagan-era capitalist mentality, and the tone is critical in making that come through. Dubbed Reaganomics, this Republican capitalist school of thought advocated for small enterprise and, quote, average Americans having the opportunity to realize the American dream through free enterprise and entrepreneurship. Ghostbusters exists to mock all of that. It's not about busting ghosts, it's about busting Reaganomics. It's about all the things that big business and capitalist politicians say is wrong with America that can be fixed if only the government would just let those honest and hardworking businesses do their thing. After all, it's the story of a group of ragtag Americans starting their own business. There's a scientist who kind of mocks privatized research and innovation. There's this licentious parapsychologist who is a stand-in for consumer psychology. There's an engineer who represents the archaic American infrastructure. And there's a blue-collar worker, specifically a black worker, who sort of mocks the fallacy that trickle-down economics will empower the marginalized and help them find more employment opportunities. And these four men really team up to create this thriving small business, right? Like they're living that American dream. But as they grow more prominent, the government tries to step in and to regulate them. And the EPA shuts them down for not properly disposing of their ghost matter or ectoplasm in an environmentally conscious way. It's setting up the government to kind of seem like this anti-American force that's trampling on the American dream. And it's through the actions of an overbearing government that all hell breaks loose. Environment bad, money good. And then at the end we get this androgynous symbol of like what the 80s would have seen as like the liberal commie youth in this like Ziggy Stardust looking ass who threatens to bring down the whole capitalist machine. But by crossing streams, or more accurately by combining the might of consumerism, blue collar workers, American infrastructure, and privatized innovation, this little mighty business is able to topple the evil liberal government that threatens to destroy our cities, our churches, and our American way of life. But what do the Ghostbusters bust? They bust ghosts. Ghosts are not real. Ghostbusters is ridiculing the consumerist nonsense that is the 1980s Reagan-era economy. By focusing on a business whose job is to catch things that don't actually exist, it's making a satire of the trickle-down theory. It's reflective of the many booms and busts that we've seen in the US, finding new meaningless shit to make businesses out of. The prosperity of the bull market 80s was based on ghosts. So with hindsight being 2020, in 2020, Ghostbusters Afterlife is about where all that Americana trickle-down bullshit left us. If we had peak Republican economic policy and prosperity in the 1980s, what happened after it died? What does post-capitalist America look like? Enter the American Afterlife. What follows is a single mother raising two children in complete economic destitution because her father spent his whole life chasing the American dream. But nothing ever came of that, and she was left in an economy that offered her no employment opportunities. She inherits her father's debts and is forced to move into a decaying town built on the arcane fracking industry where nothing has changed since the days when America was, quote, great. Afterlife is no longer mocking, but spelling out in plain words the issues that come with this alt-right way of thinking. In an almost disillusion of the American dream, we learn that the original Ghostbusters, who started that small, thriving business back in the 80s, never ended up amounting to anything. They never lived up to the promise of that Reagan era, and instead they failed to pay the mortgage. Oh look, the American housing crisis made a cameo here. And they all went on to work for the systems that didn't work for them. They went on to work in marketing and finance. We also see that the research in this new world has all been privatized to support the capitalist agenda. So the one researcher who really wants to investigate the natural impact of capitalism is left teaching summer school, where students are shown B-level horror movies, mocking what passes as education in today's America. Then we see the mythic Ivo Shandor, emblematic of a capitalist leadership from the Industrial Revolution, who made way for the phantasmic symbol of conservative propaganda, and he gets killed by it. It ends in an epic finale with a ton of callbacks to the original movie and some awesome cameos where the boomers show up to save the day, and they fail, because the fight is not for the boomers anymore. The fight is now in the hands of today's youth to go out and bust our new ghosts. It's the next generation who will continue to fight to overcome the lies, the fake news, the false dichotomies, the things that divide us that are all rooted in that ghost-chasing economy, that failing system that was built on chasing something that never existed in the first place. Ghostbusters mattered because it was about mocking the conventional wisdom of Republican policymakers in the 1980s in America. And Afterlife matters because it's about highlighting the long-term effects and impacts of that failing socioeconomic system and doing away with the disinformation that permeates our thinking, toppling the systems of old and making way for something new and better, but with all the heart and the charm of the original. If Ghostbusters was about building an economy off of dreams and ideas that were never real in the first place, then Afterlife is about learning from those mistakes and living with what that pursuit left behind. I think what this movie did from a social commentary perspective is absolutely masterful, and the way that it reboots an old franchise that's based on old ideas but introducing new ones It's a case study that I think other studios should take an important lesson from. How do you reboot a dead franchise? How do you give it life after death? How can you convey cultural concepts to a generation born out of time? How do you move the story forward? How do you move the IP forward and make it relevant to tomorrow, to the next generation? Well, if this film's philosophy is anything to go by, I think that answer is obvious. Stop chasing ghosts.